We want to talk about the differences between sudden and anticipated loss. What is a major street here in Prattville? Somebody give me a name. What? Main Street? There you go. Okay. All right. Let me give you an illustration. Let's suppose that tomorrow's a beautiful day and it's after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we've finished our sessions, and I'm walking down Main Street, and in a way off distance, I see a runner. And I think, I used to run before I knew better. And so he's sort of in my lane, even though he's way off. And so as he's getting closer and I'm walking, he's still in my lane, so I sort of move over. Well, he moves over. So getting closer, he's running, I'm walking. He's still in my lane, I move, and as it gets closer and closer, I'm thinking, what in the world is he doing? And so I move one more time, he moves one time, and he's right in front of me, and I see it coming. And he's a big guy. I mean, I'm a big guy, but he's a big guy, and he's got some force. So he runs into me and knocks me on the ground. If that were to happen, and you were the one on the ground, what would you be thinking? What thoughts would come to your mind? Why did he do that? What else? Who do you think he is? Is he going to come back again? Why did this happen? I saw it coming, but it still happened. Now, let's change the scenario just one little way. I'm walking down Main Street, minding my own business, seeing the beautiful day, and Brother Dave, he comes up from behind me. I don't hear him, I don't see him, but the end result is the same. I'm spread out on the ground. Now what would your thoughts be? What happened? Why did he do that? What was he thinking? Is it going to happen again? Am I hurt? Is he hurt? Now you say, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the differences between anticipated loss and sudden unanticipated loss. The end result is the same. You're on the ground. But at least with anticipated loss, intellectually, you saw it coming. Emotionally, you may not be ready to accept it, and that's fine. But there is a big difference between what we intellectually realize, that there is going to be a loss, versus something that just takes us completely by storm. We didn't see it, we didn't hear it, we didn't feel it, we didn't smell it, we didn't understand it, and it happened. For several years, the sheriff of the county, Lauderdale County in Florence, Alabama, was a member of the church where I preached. And so he asked me to be his police chaplain along with others. And on occasions, they'd call me and they'd ask me to put a uniform on, and the policeman in his car would come and pick me up. And then the next 30 minutes to an hour, we'd have to drive to a place we'd never been before, to knock on a door that I'd never been to before, to see people that I'd never seen before, and in a matter of 10 to 15 minutes, be able to have to tell them that a sudden, unanticipated loss had taken a loved one of theirs by death. Wasn't ever easy to do. The last time we did it, there were two of them. A homicide that we had to go tell a family about, and then a drowning of a little 5-year-old boy. It's never easy, but we just need to understand that when we're talking about anticipated loss versus sudden unanticipated loss, we may be knocked down, but at least we saw at least in some reason, what came our way to cause that versus being hit from behind and not knowing anything about it. With that idea in mind, let's look at the notes with dealing with anticipatory grief and loss. Someone said it's the experience of knowing that change is coming, that you're starting to experience bereavement in the face of that. When can anticipatory grief and loss happen? It is a reality that whenever you are anticipating a death because of cancer, because of dementia, because of whatever the case may be, you can, and in most cases will, begin to grieve before the person has died. Now you say, how in the world can you do that? Well, you begin to think about life without that person. You begin to think about the changes it's going to make in your life and in the life of your family. You begin, in some cases, based upon the kind of illness that they have, begin to grieve the future. I knew of a situation where a couple had bought a big RV and they were going to travel around, and then he developed cancer. And after 2 trips, they couldn't take any more. She was grieving that. Not only the potential loss of her husband, which happened later on about 2 years down the road, but also the grief because there was this great big RV and they were going to travel and see America themselves, and now he no longer could do that. And so maybe in your situation, if you have that kind of loss, there was that kind of feeling as well. Terminal or chronic illness, or the loss of a pet. Do animals grieve? Yes. Doctors will tell you that they will grieve. That a dog and a cat that should fight one another may be sleeping together at night in the same little bed or whatever, and that they see after one another. And there are stories of, one of them dying and the other one not being able to handle it to the point that they just go off themselves and finally die because that was such a part of their existence. And that certainly can happen. An organ transplant. You say, well, that can cause life. Yes, but that meant that the only way it causes life was because someone had to die because of other issues. And so there may be anticipated grief, even though hopefully it's going to make your life better, but you think about the grief that that family had to go through in order for that to happen, if you see that takes place. Jail or prison sentence. At the children's home, we've had children who've had to deal with that kind of grief because they may not know all the fancy words and the legal jargon, but they basically understand that the severity of what their daddy or what their mama has done means that they're not coming back to live with them. And that's tough because they realize that they're not going to be able to see their mom or dad. In some cases, states will relinquish their parental rights, and those children can be put up for adoption, because that person is going to stay behind bars the rest of his life, or her life, as the case may be. There's also another part of this. If a person is in jail for an extended, long period of time, then the family is anticipating the idea that they never will get out. Or that in some cases, because of the nature of what they did, they ultimately will die themselves. And so there's that anticipated grief. Retirement. Someone has said, when he comes home, more than likely his wife is going to grieve. Nobody raised their hands on that one. But I've heard too many stories of about a week after he got home, or maybe a month, I went back to work because we wanted our marriage to survive. But there is anticipate, I can't say the word. There is that kind of grief where there are some issues that go along with it. And when a person does finally end that career in the world of business, he or she better find something to consume their time with. Because they have found studies that have suggested that if a person that was a type A personality and was always in charge and always had the kind of work where they could give the orders and people would accept them and obey them, and they come home and they do not consume their time with something of interest and value, there have been many studies that have shown that that person with that type of situation can die in 2 years or less. So you have to anticipate, what does that retirement mean, and what am I going to do, and how am I going to consume time? Brother Dave, this is where we talk about sojourners, right? Sojourners is certainly a great work. Brother Dave and Miss Lynn came to the children's home, and oh wow, they just did an awesome job along with those other 5 couples, and made a big impression on some of our boys. We really appreciate you for what y'all did on that, and that's certainly a good work. Emotions that go along with this kind of loss. Anger. Why could there be anger in regards to someone that you anticipate is going to die? Why would you as a family member feel anger? Well, you could easily say, why him or why her? Why not me? I've known some people who've told me, my husband died and he was in a lot better health than I. And yet when the doctor said that he was going to die of this disease, I was angry because I thought, I'm the one that's got the health issues. This was just something that just came on all of a sudden. And they had a really hard time with that. But anger is certainly a part of it. Denial. Doctors, and we know that they're not gods or God, but they typically make their decisions and judgments based on information that they have, blood work and all kinds of other things. But a lot of times when they announce that someone is going to die, they may give a window of time. There can be a lot of denial that goes along with that because you just think, okay, but if they'll do this and this and this and this, then they're going to get better. Interesting book that John Claypool wrote, Tracks of a Fellow Struggler, a preacher that talks about the journey that his daughter dealt with in regards to leukemia, and the 3-year journey that ultimately ended in her death. But as he writes this, and what he did was he would preach to his congregation about his grief and put that along with the idea of the Word of God. But after the little girl did die, after about 2 years of dealing with this, on page 70 he put it this way: I did everything in my power to cope with it, talking about her ultimate death, anticipated death, realistically. In fact, I did not realize just how hopeful I really was until that Saturday afternoon as I knelt by her bed and saw her stop breathing. You may find this incredible, but I was the most shocked man in all the world at that moment. You see, deep down I did not believe that she was going to die. In spite of all my mind told me, I found myself clinging to the hope that any day a cure would be found or that God would see fit to heal her miraculously. Well, here was a minister, and yet there was that denial on his part because, one, he didn't want it to happen, and two, he kept thinking that another cure would come along. And perhaps many of you, with the anticipated loss that you dealt with, had to do that. And then guilt, the dread, the desperation, the intense preoccupation with the dying person. Guilt. Could have, should have, would have, if only. We can eat ourselves up with those words. Typically, families are going to do everything they know to do. Doctors are going to do everything they know to do. Sometimes in spite of all the wonderful means that allow people to live, there are some things that cannot be prevented. And sometimes that's just really, really, really hard, and a lot of family members will sometimes have to work through guilt because everything they did wasn't enough, which means that we're human and that we can't do everything, but that's often a lot of it. Hindsight's 20/20, right, as the old saying goes. Yeah, and we look back and we say, well, maybe if we had, but you can't, because you do only what you know to do. But that's a journey that we have to work through, and that's with both situations. That's either with anticipated loss or even sudden unanticipated loss. Because I read something recently where with a sudden unanticipated death, somebody said, well, Daddy went to visit his sister the other day. He hadn't seen her in years. I wonder if he knew something was happening. Why didn't I see that? Or why didn't we suggest that he go to this doctor sooner, and then all of a sudden he just falls out dead? Guilt is a part of both sides. But we just have to understand that we do the best that we can with what we know to do. Now, if a person did not live, if a person did not do the things that they could have done, then yeah, you may have to work through that idea of, I should have done better, I could have done better. Sometimes in family situations, if a person is in the process of dying, there will be sometimes family members that live off in the far distance, and they don't see mom or dad in the same light that the children that are nearby see them, because they see their demise on a daily basis. Sis comes from some other place, and she flies in, and she says, well, she's really not that bad. I mean, and they're doing this, and they're doing this for them. They're called seagull children. They fly in, and then they fly out, and then they often leave you with the mess to clean up. And I mean that kindly, but sometimes that happens in families. But guilt is something that we really have to deal with. And with anticipated loss, it is something that we begin to think about. Somebody said on page 2, conventional grief is grieving backwards. The death occurs and then we begin to grieve. But with anticipated loss, it's grieving forward. We're grieving ahead of time because we see what we're thinking about. And we may not understand all the wheres and wherefores of what that loss is going to mean, but we begin to see that ahead of time. Some have said that even dying patients deal with anticipated grief and loss because they feel like there's a roller coaster going on. They have a lot of good days and a whole lot of sad days, and they can't experience all the emotions at the same time. And so then there's guilt over those shifting emotions. It's been said that folks who do deal with grief before the loss and begin to grieve with that in some cases that helps them after the death has occurred. Others have said, no, it really didn't help. Even though I grieved because of what was going to happen once mom was not going to be here, still, it's such a big, big, big pain in my life. Redefining is the process in which everybody gets on the same page, looks at the situation and says, okay, what can we do to make her last months, her last weeks, her last days as well as possible? That's called redefining, where everybody gets on the same page. Mutual pretense is where everybody's pretending they're really not that bad when in fact we know what they are. And so it's really important to redefine if we're dealing with someone who is in the process of ultimately dying, to try to make the very best of their time the very best that they can. Somebody during the break was telling me about them knowing about their father and the time that they had given before their death would occur. And that person was mentioning how important it was for them to be able to listen to life's lessons, knowing that there would be a day when that father could not share those lessons with them. And they made the point, they said, it was some of the best times in my life because I knew there was an end to this. I knew that ultimately they were going to die. And so I learned all these lessons from them. And when they died, the grief was a whole lot less because we had already begun to grieve. And we had used those last times to make the very best we could and to learn lessons from them. Dr. Brock Byock, Ira Byock, says there's 4 words with anticipated loss that we do well to remember. Please forgive me. I forgive you. Thank you, and I love you. Sometimes we have to tell people we forgive them for our sakes. Sometimes they may have not repented. Sometimes they may have not changed. But they need to know that we're willing to try to forgive them and that we're willing to love them to the very, very end. And that's really important. Any questions or any comments before we begin to look at sudden, unanticipated loss? Again, after the break, feel free to come back and visit with me as long as you'd like to. But let's look at sudden unanticipated loss. And we'll have to do this quickly. You see the notes there with sudden unanticipated loss. There is that capacity to cope that is not there because you just saw them. You just heard them. All those things happened. Your ordinary world has become shattered. Someone that was always a part of your life is no longer there, and you had no way of realizing it. With men, there's also the intense need to assign responsibility, to try to find out answers. Men often will spend a great deal of time talking to the police, talking to the hospitals, whatever the case may be, to try to find out something about why this sudden, unexpected death occurred. And it's really important to know that time perception is often distorted. What that means is this. If you're dealing with somebody in the church who's lost someone suddenly, 8 o'clock in the morning doesn't mean anything to them. So you need to work on their time frame because time has stood still for them. And so we need to keep that in mind. The factors complicating recovery and sudden loss, there's no chance to say goodbye. There is often that unfinished business. I've encouraged sometimes people to write a letter to their loved ones when they didn't get to say goodbye, simply to tell them just how much they meant to them. And then either keep that letter or bury it beside where they are because you're doing everything that you can to let them know just how important they were. If that loss occurs whenever there were things that weren't going on too well. Lady in Mississippi told me about having an argument with her father before he went to work. And she, after the argument, slammed the door as she went out the house. And he went on to work. And as he went to work and was working there, he had a heart attack and died. And she felt really guilty and had to work through the idea that her daddy had a big issue with heart problems already, that perhaps the argument may have not helped things, but it certainly didn't cause it. But that was something that she had to work through. If trauma's involved, there's the violence, the legal system that goes along with it. Children will tend to regress during times of sudden loss. Children that, had been able to control themselves now go back to bedwetting, or little ones begin to suck their thumbs again. The reason is this. Their world has been violated. They don't understand why it is that all the adults are crying over in the corner and mommy and daddy are not laughing and talking and not even trying to keep them correct. They're just allowing them to do whatever they want to do. Their world has been violated. They don't understand it. They don't have the capacity to understand that. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. And so in sudden unanticipated loss, it's important to try to keep the rules as much as possible, the same rules during the grief situation as before, because they're just looking to see if somebody really cares for them. And they may be acting out simply for that very reason. And then there's often the unawareness of being able to understand exactly what's going on. The last handouts talk about complications of sudden loss. There is that sense of unreality that lasts for a long, 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 long time. There is that often normal sense of guilt, trying to blame someone or something for what has happened. That helplessness because of the unfinished business and the insecurity and the fear. And then at the very end, you see the things that can be done to help people in a sudden loss. Again, grief comes in one size, extra large. The greatest loss in this room is yours, whatever it is. But we just need to understand, as elders, as ministers, as church members, as neighbors, that there is a big, distinct difference in an anticipated loss versus something where there was no idea, no thought, no knowledge of that sudden, unanticipated loss. And that loss, the sudden, unanticipated loss, is going to take longer to work through because there's more questions and less answers as opposed to the anticipated loss. Doesn't mean that one becomes greater than the other. They're both bad, but just understand the differences. As we close tonight, any thoughts or any questions that you would like to ask before I tell you what we're going to be talking about tomorrow? Again, we'd love for you to stay around as long as you'd like to, and we really appreciate it. Those diabetic cookies are still back there, I bet. And I bet they'd let you take one home with you. Somebody save me a macadamia. No, I'm just kidding. Tomorrow morning at 8:30, we'll be talking about what do you know about grief and loss, a little test that we're going to give. And then after that, we're going to talk about the emotions of loss and grief, especially as they pertain to things other than death. And then we're going to talk about something that perhaps you didn't know that you had, but you do have. And that's your grief room. And I want to show you some pictures of some grief rooms. And then we will finish up before noon tomorrow by talking about how does one make it through the grief journey. And so my hope is that you will come and be a part of this and that we'll be able to share with one another these thoughts concerning this and that it will be of help to you. Feel free to go home tonight and say, hey, they didn't pass the hat. It didn't cost us anything. And they even fed us. And love and invite people to come back and be a part of it. I want to turn it over to you for the final part of it.